There are things that do not arrive as revelations. They arrive as confirmations, quiet, precise, the way a key turns in a lock you did not know had been installed. You have been standing at that door for years, not quite certain what was on the other side of it, and then one evening at a table full of people you have known your entire life, the lock turns and you understand that you have always known, and that the knowing has simply been waiting for you to stop arguing with it. My name is Miriam Calloway. I am 34 years old. I am a grants administrator at a federal research organization, living in Nashville, Tennessee. I have held this position for 6 years. Before that, I spent 3 years in graduate school in Cincinnati, and before that I grew up in a house outside Knoxville where Thanksgiving was the most important day of the year, and where I learned very early that importance and visibility are not the same thing. I want to tell you what I did for that holiday. Not in general terms. In specific ones. Because the specific ones are the only honest way to say this, and I have spent a long time softening the specific ones into general ones, and I am done doing that. I drove 3 hours from Nashville every November, leaving before 6 in the morning to arrive before anyone else, so that I could begin the setup before my mother had to think about it. Not because she asked me to. Because I had learned, over the course of many Novembers, that if I did not arrive early, certain things would not be done, and that if those things were not done, the day would feel thin, and that if the day felt thin, my mother would feel it and not say anything, and I would feel her feeling it and not say anything, and we would both move through the day carrying that particular silent weight. And by evening it would have settled into everyone at the table whether they knew it or not. So I drove. I left at 5:47. I arrived at 8:39. That is how those mornings worked. I managed the family group calendar from October onward. The reminder went out in the second week of October. I sent it every year from my personal email because the one time I sent it from the family group chat it got buried under 17 other messages about something else entirely, and my uncle did not see it until the first week of November, which was too late for him to arrange his travel. After the reminder, I followed up in the first week of November. Then I confirmed the final head count by the Wednesday before the holiday because my mother needed the head count to finalize the roast size and the bread order and the number of chairs at the folding table extension. She had told me once, in the kitchen, while we were both standing at the counter doing something else entirely, that the head count was the thing that made her the most anxious. I had not forgotten this. I made sure the head count was resolved 4 days before she needed it. I booked my grandmother Edith's travel from Chattanooga every single year. My grandmother was 81. She had stopped driving after dark 3 years earlier, after an incident on I-75 that she described to me on the phone the following morning in her careful, understated way, and after which I had called the car service in Chattanooga and set up an account and given them her address and told them she would need pickup every November on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and return on the Friday. Every October I called to confirm. Every year the car came. My grandmother had told me once, also on the phone, that arriving by car felt dignified. I had not told anyone that I had arranged this. It had not occurred to me that it required telling. I coordinated the dietary requirements for 14 people. This sounds administrative when I say it that way, and it was, but it was also something else. It was 14 years of knowing that my uncle's sodium restriction had changed twice, that my cousin's gluten sensitivity had been diagnosed in 2019, and that she was still learning which things contained gluten, and that she would not always ask, that my brother's girlfriend the year she was vegan had felt embarrassed about it, and had told me quietly, and I had made sure there were 3 substantial dishes at the table that she could eat without having to announce her choices to the room. It was the year my father's cardiologist changed his guidelines 3 weeks before the holiday, and my mother called me on a Tuesday evening in a low, tight voice. We spent 47 minutes on the phone working through the menu from the beginning. We got it right. I sent the family photograph to the print shop every December. The photograph was taken every Thanksgiving in the backyard, in the same spot against the fence where the rose of Sharon grew, in a spot my father had marked years ago with a small flat stone because the light was good there in the late afternoon. I took the photograph every year on my phone, and every December I sent it to a print shop on Charlotte Avenue in Nashville that did good framing, and I had it printed and matted and framed in a simple dark wood frame that matched the others, and I brought the framed copy the following November and added it to the row on the mantel. That row was 17 frames long. I had organized 14 of them. The first 3 were from before I was old enough to manage it. The last 14 were mine. I did not tell anyone I was doing this. Not as a strategy. Not as a test. I did not tell anyone because it had never occurred to me that it required announcement. I did it because it needed doing, and I was the person who could see that it needed doing and who had the specific competence to do it reliably. That is how I have always worked. That is the thing I want you to understand about me before I tell you what happened at that table. I was not waiting for a ceremony. I was not keeping a ledger of what I was owed. I was doing what I did because the thing mattered to me and because I was good at it and because I had told myself for a long time that the doing was enough, that the work itself was the satisfaction. I had been telling myself this for 14 years. I had gotten very good at believing it. Thanksgiving that year had the same shape as every other year until it didn't. On the 6th of November, 6 days before Thanksgiving, I received notice that my proposal for a multi-year federal research grant had been approved. It was the largest grant my organization had ever received from that particular program. I had spent 14 months writing it. The methodology section had taken me 4 months alone, working on it before 7 in the morning before the rest of the office arrived, and on weekend afternoons at my kitchen table, and on one particular Saturday in March, when I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger for 2 hours because I had gone to get groceries and then found, when I turned off the engine, that I could not stop thinking about the framing problem in Section 4, and I pulled out my laptop and I sat in that parking lot, and I solved it. My director called me into his office at 11:14 in the morning the day the approval came through. He shook my hand. He told me the review panel had specifically named my methodology section as the reason the proposal had advanced. I sat with that for a moment in his office. I remember the way the afternoon sun came through the half-closed blinds and lay in thin parallel lines across his desk. I remember the specific quality of the silence in the room after he finished speaking, and I thought clearly and simply, I want to tell my family. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the third ring. I told her about the grant. I told her what it was, what it covered, what the review panel had said. She said, "That's wonderful, honey." There was a warmth in her voice that I recognized, the particular warmth she reserved for things that pleased her, but that she did not entirely have context for. The warmth of someone who loves you and cannot quite locate what you are describing. She asked if I would still be coming for Thanksgiving. I said yes. She asked about the sweet potato situation. My uncle had new guidelines. She wasn't sure about the brown sugar. We talked about the sweet potatoes for 11 minutes. I told her about the ratio. She wrote it down. I did not think again about the grant for the rest of the week. It had been named. It had been heard. I had told her. That is what I believed. I left Nashville on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving at 5:47 in the morning. The sky over Nashville was still dark when I pulled out of my parking spot, the kind of dark that is not quite night anymore but has not committed to morning, and I drove east on I-40 with the heater running and the radio on low, and the city giving way gradually to the open stretch of highway that runs toward the Cumberland Plateau. I have made this drive so many times that I no longer really see it. My hands know it. My body knows it. I arrive in Knoxville, and I am already in the particular mental register of being at my parents' house, which is different from every other register I operate in, lower and quieter and slightly more careful, the way you adjust your posture in a room where the ceilings are lower than you are used to. I arrived at my parents' house at 8:39. My father was in the kitchen with the coffee on and the morning news running on the small television on the counter. He handed me a mug when I came in. We talked about the drive for a few minutes and then he went back to his paper and I went to the dining room and began the setup. I unfolded the extra table leaf and locked it in place. I reconfigured the chair arrangement to accommodate my cousin Terrence's wheelchair on the right side of the table, nearest the kitchen door, which required moving 4 chairs and the small side table that usually sat against the wall, and repositioning the extra folding chairs that lived in the coat closet. I found the good tablecloth in the linen drawer and put it on. I set out the good dishes. My mother kept the good dishes in the cabinet above the refrigerator, which required the step stool, and the step stool was in the garage, and I went to the garage and got it. By 10 o'clock the table was set and the side dishes were organized, and I had been to the grocery store once already for the 3 items my mother had realized on Wednesday night she had forgotten. Marcus arrived at noon with his girlfriend Stephanie. Marcus had been promoted to regional manager at his company in September. I knew this because he had called me when it happened at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, and we had talked for 22 minutes, and I had told him I was proud of him, and I had meant it. He came in with a bottle of wine and a bakery box, and Stephanie gave me a hug and said she loved my apartment the one time she had visited and asked if I had done anything new with it. I said I had been tending a fig tree. She said that was wonderful. She meant it. Diane and her husband arrived at 1:30. Diane had bought her first home in October, a house in Maryville she had been looking for 3 years, and she was incandescent with it. She talked about the kitchen and the yard and the school district for the children they did not yet have but were planning, and the warmth around her was real, and I felt it too. My cousin Terrence and his wife came at 2. By 3:30 there were 14 people in the house, and I had made a second trip to the grocery store at 11:15, had confirmed my grandmother's car service when the driver texted at noon that he was on schedule, had resolved a question about the roast timing with my mother, and had quietly moved the coat rack from the front hall to the bedroom to create space for Terrence's chair to pass through the entry. My grandmother Edith arrived at 4 o'clock in the car service sedan. She came through the front door in her Goodwill coat, the dark green one she wore for occasions, and she stood in the entry and looked around the room with the inventory expression she had always had, the slow, thorough look of someone who is counting and assessing and filing. Then she found me, standing at the edge of the living room with a dish towel in my hands, and she said, "There you are." She said it the way she always said it, not as a greeting, as a fact, as a statement of location. As if she had been looking for me specifically and had now confirmed my coordinates and could proceed accordingly. I went to her and kissed her cheek, and she held my arm for a moment with both hands the way she did, firmly, briefly, before she let go and allowed herself to be guided toward the living room. The table was full at 5 o'clock. 14 people. My grandmother and my father's right. Diane across from me. Marcus next to Diane with Stephanie beside him. My uncle and his wife at the far end. Terrence and his wife at the kitchen side. The empty chair with my grandfather's photograph propped against the back, the way it had been for 9 years. My mother stood at 5:12. She was wearing the burgundy blouse she saved for Thanksgiving. She had her cream notebook in both hands, the small one, spiral-bound, with the water stain on the lower right corner that had been there for at least 4 years. She looked around the table. She took a breath. She said, "Before we begin, I want to take a moment for the year." She had said this, or something close to it, every Thanksgiving since I was 19. The words were so familiar that they had become atmospheric, part of the room, like the smell of the roast and the particular quality of the light from the chandelier my parents had installed in 2009. I had heard those words 14 times. I was not prepared, on the 15th time, for them to mean something different than they had meant before. My mother opened the notebook. She found her place. She looked up at my father and said his name. My father retired in August after 31 years with the county engineering department. 31 years. She said this, and the table softened, and my father tilted his head in the way he had that was as close to modesty as he got, and my uncle said something about all the roads in Knox County, and there was laughter. My mother turned to Diane. Diane and her husband had purchased their first home in October. She named the street. She said, "A home of their own," after 3 years of looking. Diane reached across the table and her husband took her hand, and she was luminous with it. She was genuinely luminous, and I looked at her face and I thought, good. This is good. She deserves this. She turned to Marcus. Marcus had been promoted to regional manager in September, the youngest person in his company to hold the role at his level. She named this. Marcus said something self-deprecating. People laughed. Stephanie touched his arm. She turned the page. Terrence's wife had completed her certification program in occupational therapy in November, after 2 years of night courses. She named this. There was applause, real applause, people putting their palms together. Terrence's wife said thank you and looked at her plate with the particular expression of someone who is not used to being named and does not quite know what to do with it. My mother looked at the notebook. I watched her look at it. I watched her eyes move across the page and stop. I watched her look up. She did not look at me. She looked at the middle distance at the space above the table, the practiced look of a person who is transitioning from one thing to the next. She said, Let us be grateful for this year and for this table. She closed the notebook. I was sitting 3 feet to her left. I want you to understand the specific geometry of that moment. Not metaphorically, physically. I was in the 4th chair on the left side of the table. My mother was standing at the head of the table, which is the left end. The distance between her left elbow and my right shoulder was approximately 3 feet. I had been in that chair, at that distance from her, for 14 Thanksgivings. She had looked at the notebook and closed it and moved to the blessing, and I was 34 years old, and I was a grants administrator, and 6 days earlier I had called her and told her, and she had said, "That's wonderful, honey," and she had not written it down. There is a particular quality to that kind of moment. I said this at the beginning, and I want to say it again more precisely now, because I have thought about it many times in the months since. It does not feel like an injury in the first second. Your body does not register it as pain. What it registers is the completion of a pattern, the closing of a loop that has been open for a very long time. It is the feeling of a word you have been trying to remember suddenly arriving. Not relief, not pleasure, but recognition. The irrefutable, unambiguous recognition of something that has always been true and that you have been, for years, constructing elaborate alternative explanations for. She had not written it down because she had not thought to. She had not thought to because the architecture of her attention had never included me as a category of achiever. I was the one who managed things. I was the one who arrived early and called the car service and handled the dietary requirements and brought the framed photograph. I was the infrastructure. Infrastructure is not named at the table. Infrastructure is the reason the table stands. I understood this in the 40 seconds after she closed the notebook. The conversation had moved on immediately. My uncle was asking my father something. Diane was talking to Stephanie about the house. Someone was passing the bread. The table had reestablished itself as completely and as quickly as water reestablishes itself after you remove your hand. There was no evidence anywhere in the room that anything had happened. Across the table, my grandmother Edith looked at me. Not with pity. Not with the quick conspiratorial sympathy of someone who wants to acknowledge the thing without making it real by naming it in front of the others. She looked at me the way she had looked at me when I came through the door. Inventory, assessment, location confirmed. She looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded, once. The smallest possible motion, barely visible, the kind of nod that is less a gesture than a declaration. I saw it. I see you. I know exactly what just happened, and so do you. I held her gaze for 1 second. Then I looked at my plate. I picked up my fork. I took 1 bite of the sweet potatoes, the ones my mother and I had worked out together on the phone 11 days earlier, 47 minutes, the sodium calculation, the brown sugar ratio. They were correct. The ratio was right. I had been right. I set my fork down on the rim of my plate. I set it down quietly, not as a gesture, just as the thing you do when you are finished with something. I folded my napkin and placed it to the left of my plate. I pushed my chair back from the table, and the sound of the chair on the hardwood was the only sound I made, and nobody looked up. I picked up my plate, and I carried it to the kitchen, and I set it on the counter beside the sink. I walked to the front entryway. I took my keys from the hook on the wall, the hook I had installed 3 Thanksgivings ago, a Tuesday evening in early November, because my mother had mentioned she had nowhere to put her keys when she came in from the garage, a small brushed nickel hook I had found at the hardware store on my lunch break and brought with me that November and installed in 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. I put on my coat. I walked out the front door. It was 5:31 in the evening. The temperature in Knoxville was 41 degrees. The sky was the specific dense gray of a November evening that has been overcast all day and is settling now into the particular dark that comes before full night. Not dramatic, not stormy, just heavy and still and certain of itself. I stood on the front step for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet. The house behind me was full of sound, voices, silverware, the low register of the television my father had left on in the kitchen. I walked to my car. I got in. I closed the door. I sat in my car in my parents' driveway, and I did not cry. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not cry, not because I was holding it together, not because I was numb, but because what I was feeling was not the kind of thing that produces tears. It was structural. It was the sensation I described before, The building under lateral pressure finally being relieved of what it was leaning against. Not collapse. Not grief. Realignment. The slow, almost imperceptible settling of a structure that has been holding itself at a compensating angle for so long that it has forgotten what upright felt like, and is now, very slowly, remembering. I sat in that driveway for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know this because I looked at the clock when I got in 5:31, and I looked at it again when I started the car, 5:35. For minutes and 17 seconds of sitting in my parents' driveway on Thanksgiving evening, in the dark, in 41 degrees, while 14 people ate dinner 14 feet away from me. I pulled out of the driveway at 5:35. I did not look back at the house. This was not a statement. There was simply nothing behind me that I needed to see. I drove north. I drove without the radio. The heater ran, and the windows fogged slightly at the edges, and I cleared the driver's side with the back of my hand and drove. The highway out of Knoxville moves through a stretch of industrial corridor before it opens up, the orange lights of the warehouse district, the highway interchange, the long curve past the truck stop where my father had stopped once when I was 9 because I needed the bathroom, and the memory of that stop, the fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee and diesel, is so specific and so ordinary that it comes back to me sometimes when I least expect it. I passed the truck stop. I kept driving. I want to tell you what I thought about on that drive because it matters and because I have told this story several times now in my own head, and I always skip this part, and skipping it is a way of protecting something that does not need to be protected anymore. I thought about the first year I had managed the Thanksgiving calendar. I was 20 years old. I had come home from college for the holiday and found my mother in the kitchen at 11 o'clock the night before, standing at the counter with a legal pad and a look on her face that I recognized, the look of someone who is managing too many things at once and has just discovered that one of the things she thought was handled is not handled. I had taken the legal pad from her. I had sat down at the kitchen table. I had worked through the head count and the table configuration and the grocery list until midnight, and my mother had gone to bed, and I had felt, finishing the list at the kitchen table with the house quiet around me, the particular satisfaction of a problem solved. I thought, that is where it started. At a kitchen table at midnight when I was 20 years old, and I looked at a problem that needed solving and I solved it and nobody told me to and I did not ask permission, and I felt good doing it. And then I did it the next year. And the year after that. And at some point, without anyone deciding anything, I became the person who did this, and the family became the family that had a person who did this, and the holiday became the holiday that worked the way it worked because I was making it work, and not one person in that house, including me, ever said any of this out loud. I thought about the framed photographs. 17 frames on the mantel. I had organized 14 of them. I thought about the specific physical act of carrying a framed photograph from Nashville to Knoxville every November, wrapped in a kitchen towel, so it would not slide around in the back seat. I thought about the print shop on Charlotte Avenue, and the man there who had learned my preferences after the 3rd year, and who always asked about the mat width. I thought about how every year when I added the new frame to the mantel, I straightened all 17 of them, because they shifted over the course of the year, and every year my mother would come into the living room while I was doing this and say, "You always notice things like that." Not as an observation about me as a person, as a passing comment, as something you say to fill the silence while someone is doing a task. I thought about the grant. 14 months. The Saturday afternoon in the Kroger parking lot. The methodology section. My director's office at 11:14 in the morning. The thin parallel lines of light across his desk. The phone call that evening. The 11 minutes about sweet potatoes. She had said, "That's wonderful, honey." And she had meant it. I want to be clear about this. I believe she meant it. I believe there was real warmth in her voice. I believe she was glad for me. And then she had hung up the phone and gone back to whatever she was doing, and the grant had not found a place in the architecture of her attention. And when she sat down with the cream notebook in the days before Thanksgiving to write the year's milestones, it had not been there. Not because she wanted to omit me, because she had never learned to see me. These are different things. I understand that they are different things. Understanding that they are different things does not make the omission smaller. It makes it, if anything, more precise. An attack can be responded to. A pattern can only be named. I arrived at my apartment in Nashville at 7:42 in the evening. I parked in my assigned spot in the lot behind the building. I sat in the car for 2 more minutes. The lot was quiet. A light was on in the apartment above mine. I could see it from the car, the warm rectangle of someone else's evening. I got out of the car. I went inside. My apartment is small, and it is entirely mine. I have a kitchen table with 2 chairs that I found at an estate sale in Germantown, solid oak, older than I am, with the small dents and marks that furniture accumulates when it is used by people who are living their actual lives. I have a reading lamp in the corner of the living room that I bought at the same estate sale, a tall lamp with a warm-tone bulb that my friend Clara says makes the room look like a painting. I have a small fig tree on the kitchen windowsill that I bought 3 years ago at the farmer's market from a woman who told me it was a brown turkey variety and that it would fruit if I was patient and kept it near light. I have been patient. I have kept it near light. I sat down at the kitchen table at 7:44. I did not turn on the overhead light. I turned on the reading lamp and I sat at the table in the warm light, and I looked at the 2 chairs and the lamp and the fig tree on the windowsill, and I let the weight be there, not pushing it down, not reframing it, not telling myself the story I had been telling myself for 14 years. The story where the doing was the point, where the work was its own satisfaction, where the fact that no one was watching did not matter because I knew what I had built, and that was enough. I let the weight be what it actually was, which was this. It had not been enough. Not because the work was not real, or the competence was not real, or the love I had put into those Thanksgiving mornings was not real. It had not been enough because I am a person and not infrastructure, and people require acknowledgement the way buildings do not, and I had been telling myself for 14 years that I did not require it, and I had been wrong, and I had known I was wrong for longer than I wanted to admit. And sitting at that table on Thanksgiving evening with the lamp on, and the fig tree on the windowsill, and the weight of it finally allowed to be its full size, I stopped arguing with the knowing. I ate a bowl of soup at 8:15. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I slept for 9 hours, which was 3 more hours than I normally slept, and I woke up the next morning with the specific clarity of a person who has finally set down something very heavy, and I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I felt, under the clarity, the particular low ache of something that has been true for a long time, and has only just been permitted to be true out loud. My mother texted me at 9 the next morning. The text said, "We didn't realize you had left. Your father was worried. Are you all right?" I read the text. I noticed the specific word. Didn't realize. Not we were worried when you left, not we wanted to make sure you got home. Didn't realize. The structure of the sentence was the structure of an innocent party who has been surprised by an outcome they did not anticipate, rather than the structure of a person who is examining the events that produced the outcome. I am not saying this to indict her. I am saying it because the sentence confirmed, in its exact wording, the thing I had understood the night before at the table. She genuinely had not noticed. This is what I had been living inside. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. I did not reply for 11 days. In those 11 days, this is what happened. My brother Marcus called once on the Sunday and left a voicemail that said he hoped everything was okay and asked if I had gotten home safely. My sister Diane texted on the Monday to say she hoped I wasn't coming down with something. My mother sent a second text on the Wednesday asking about the group calendar for Christmas, who was handling it this year. Did I have the contact information for the rental company she used in December? She couldn't find a sheet I had sent last year. On the following Saturday, she sent a third text asking if I had the receipt from the print shop because she couldn't find the framed photograph from last year and thought it might still be in Diane's car. I read each of these messages. I did not reply to any of them. I want to tell you what those 11 days felt like, because I think this is the part of this kind of story that people do not tell accurately. They tell it as either relief, the protagonist freed, light, liberated, or as grief, the protagonist bereft, mourning the family she has lost. The actual experience is neither of those. It is quieter and more ambiguous and more specific than either of those. What those 11 days felt like was this. Like the first days after you stop a repetitive physical task that you've been doing for so long that your body has organized itself around it. There is the absence of the task. There is the absence of the low-grade background hum of thinking about the task. There is the space where the task used to live, and in the first days the space feels strange, almost uncomfortable, the way a healed wound sometimes aches in its absence. And then, slowly, the space begins to feel like space. and then it begins to feel like yours. On the 14th of December, 30 days after Thanksgiving, my grandmother Edith called me at 8:30 in the morning. She did not say hello the way most people say hello. She said, "I want to tell you something." I said I was listening. I had my coffee and I was sitting at the kitchen table, and the fig tree on the windowsill caught the early December light the way it did in the mornings, the leaves translucent at the edges. She told me she had known my mother for 56 years. She said that when my mother was young, growing up in her family, achievement had been a resource that was distributed carefully and not generously. There was a fixed amount of recognition available in that household, or so the household believed, and if you gave it to one person, you had given away something that could not be recovered for anyone else. She said she was not telling me this to excuse what had happened. She was explicit about this. She said, "This is not an excuse, and I am not offering it as one." She said she was telling me so that I would understand the shape of it, so that I would not spend the next 10 years constructing an explanation that made it about my specific inadequacy, because it had never been about my inadequacy. It had been about what my mother had learned to do with scarcity, a scarcity that had not been real, but that she had inherited and carried and never examined. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "You are very good at your work. I know this because I asked Patricia in your director's office about it."
She paused.
"Don't be offended. I am 81, and my tools are limited." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in 30 days. It came out of me the way things come out of you when your body has been holding tension for a long time and finds, unexpectedly, a small opening, not a release, not a resolution, just a brief unclenching. My grandmother heard it and said nothing, which was the right response. We talked for 42 minutes. She told me things about my mother's childhood that I had not known. She told me things about her own marriage that surprised me. She said toward the end of the call that she thought I had been tending my family the way I tended my fig tree, patiently, consistently, without demanding proof of growth, and that the difference was that the fig tree was in a pot that belonged to me and the family was not. She said, "You are allowed to decide what is in your pot." Before we hung up, she said, "Come to Chattanooga before the new year. I will make the green soup." I said I would come. On the 19th of December, I sat at my kitchen table at 6:47 in the evening, and I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. She said my name, Miriam, with the particular inflection she used when she was relieved and slightly wounded at the same time, the inflection that meant, "You have been gone, and your going has cost me something, and I would like you to understand this without my having to say it." I said, "I want to tell you something. I am going to say it once." She was quiet. I said, "At Thanksgiving dinner you read the year's milestones aloud. You named Dad's retirement and Diane's house and Marcus's promotion. On the 6th of November, 6 days before Thanksgiving, I called you and I told you that I had received a national federal research grant. It was the largest grant my organization has ever received from that program. I had spent 14 months writing it. You said, 'That's wonderful, honey.' You did not write it down. At the table you closed the notebook without saying my name. I was sitting 3 feet to your left." She was quiet. Then she said, "Miriam, I wasn't trying to." I said, "I know. That is exactly what I have been sitting with." She said, "Can we talk about this?" "I want to." I said, "You can. I also want to tell you that I am not going to be managing the Thanksgiving coordination going forward. I am not going to be booking Grandma's travel or sending the calendar or handling the head count or bringing the framed photograph. I wanted you to know." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't know you were doing all of that." I said, "I know." The line was quiet. I listened to the quality of the silence on the other end, the specific, dense silence of someone who is processing something and has not yet found the shape of a response. I waited in it for 11 seconds. Then I said, "I'll talk to you soon." I ended the call. It was 7:09 in the evening. I set my phone down on the table. I looked at the lamp. I looked at the fig tree. I looked at the 2 chairs and the table and the ordinary objects of my ordinary evening, and I felt the specific settled quality of a person who has said the true thing plainly, without cruelty and without apology, and who does not need a particular response in order for the saying to have meant something. I had said it. That was the end of my obligation to the explanation. That was 8 months ago. The Thanksgiving coordination did not happen this year. My mother called Marcus in the second week of October and asked him to send out the reminder. He sent one text to the family group chat on October 31st. 4 people responded. My uncle's response was a thumbs-up emoji. The head count was not confirmed until the Tuesday before the holiday. My mother called the property management company herself to ask about the rental for the Christmas gathering and discovered the account was in my name. Nobody booked my grandmother's car service. My grandmother drove herself on Wednesday evening and called me from the driveway when she arrived to tell me she had made it, which was how I knew the car service had not been arranged, because she only called to report her arrival when she had driven herself. I was in Nashville on Thanksgiving. I cooked for myself a small roast, the bread I had been learning to make since January, a bottle of wine from a vineyard in the hill country I had visited in March with my friend Clara. I set one place at the kitchen table. I ate at 5:30 in the evening, the same time I would have been sitting down at my parents' table in Knoxville, and I thought briefly about the 17 frames on the mantel. The last one I had added was 2 years ago, the one I had brought in a kitchen towel in the back seat, and I thought, they're not adding one this year. Nobody has taken the photograph. And then I thought about my own table, and the lamp, and the bread I had made, which had come out correctly for the first time after 7 months of trying, and I thought about my grandmother in Chattanooga eating her own Thanksgiving with the neighbor she had been eating Thanksgiving with for 30 years, and I thought about Clara, who had texted me that morning with a photograph of the terrible turkey she was attempting for the first time, and I felt something I could only describe as sufficient, not triumphant, not vindicated, just in possession of my own life, at my own table, in my own November, with bread that I had made myself and a fig tree on the windowsill that was, quietly, still growing. Gratitude is not a performance you owe to people who have never asked what you are carrying. Presence is not the same as being seen. Showing up is not the same as mattering, and I do not mean that cynically, I mean it precisely, as a distinction that took me 34 years to understand, and that I am still learning to live inside without apology. On a Tuesday morning in February, I was watering the fig tree on my windowsill when I noticed it had put out 3 new leaves since November. Small leaves, pale and translucent at the edges, the specific tender green of something new that has not yet had to prove itself. I stood there for a moment with the watering can in my hand and the winter light coming through the window and the coffee going on the counter and the apartment quiet around me, and I looked at those 3 leaves, and I thought, this is what it looks like when something grows because you are tending it in the right conditions, and not because you are performing the tending for an audience that may or may not be watching. That was enough. It was more than enough. If you have ever sat at a table full of people who are supposed to know you, and managed the meal they are eating, and coordinated the travel of the people sitting at it, and organized the photographs that document it, and waited, really waited, the kind of waiting that lives in your jaw and your shoulders, and the particular careful way you hold yourself in rooms where you are doing invisible work. Waited for someone to say the specific true thing about who you are and what you have been. Building while everyone else was doing something else, I want to ask you something gently. How long have you been tending other people's traditions while your own life waited on the windowsill for you to come home to it? And what would it mean, not dramatically, not as a statement, but simply and quietly, to decide that the thing growing on your windowsill deserves at least as much of your patience as the things you have been tending for people who have never once asked you how you do it?